The inquiry looking into the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act has been focusing today on protests at the border last winter. It has heard about a warning from the Canada Border Services Agency that those blockades posed a threat to the nation's economic security and prosperity. The CBC's Karina Roman has been listening. So, Karina, what have we heard so far?
Well, we heard this morning from John Ossowski. He was the former head of the CBSA, obviously talking about the various ports of entry across Canada, especially the ones that were blocked at different times or had the potential to be blocked. So we're talking about Coutts, Windsor, Emerson, the alternative bridges that they had to redirect traffic to because of the closure of the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, Cornwall, which was a potential concern, the Pacific Highway in British Columbia. And we heard that the diversion of traffic, especially in southwestern Ontario, was really only so successful. I mean, yes, some trucks then were able to get across, but they had to be diverted hundreds of kilometers around, and there was just a lot of trucks that just never made it across. We heard about that they assessed their threat to CBSA officers as well as to the infrastructure at the port of entries as quite low, but their main concern was economic. And the fact that you had this just-in-time delivery system, especially for the automobile sector, which some plants had to shut down. And so that whole economic argument and the fact that these blockades and backups really had that kind of impact is something that the Government of Canada lawyer happily tried to bring out in her cross-examination of the former head of the CBSA. Have a listen.
What we're seeing is time-accelerated footage of the backup at the Blue Water Bridge as of February 8th, which is the second day of the blockade in Windsor. Right?
Yes.
You mentioned before, you said at one point this backup was approximately 10 kilometers long.
That's correct.
Well, let it continue to play while I ask my questions. When we look at a backup of this nature, would this meet the 1 hour service standard for processing that the CBSA sets?
Absolutely not.
Now, the economic impact focus continued this afternoon with two senior officials from Transport Canada, one the Deputy Minister, the other the Chief Economist. They talked about how they were struck in the beginning by just the sheer scale of the blockages, that people and protesters were laughing at any fines that were issued, that enforcement officials were swarmed. That was mostly in Ottawa and Windsor. Yes, there was concern over the immediate transport of essential goods that people needed right then and there, but the long-term harms is what they were really worried about. The billions of dollars being lost every day when auto plants would be closed because that money is never coming back. He talked about how the auto plants that were affected went as far south as Kentucky. This is not just a Canadian issue. And because of that, there was a real threat to have permanent devastation of the economy in Canada because we were not going to be a trusted trade partner anymore. That was the huge concern, because this was happening just when investment decisions were being made, especially for Ontario, in terms of the auto sector. And what happens if instead those companies choose to invest in a location in America? Michael Keenan, the Deputy Minister for Transport, talked about that, saying that we did dodge a bullet, but he explains that it was a real near miss.
Canada was still able to land a number of billion-dollar investment decisions by automakers like Stellantis, Honda, GM in the following months, all made billion-dollar investment decisions in Ontario. If this had gone on longer, if it had been repeated, then any one of those could have been easily unwound, because a big decision like that is not final until it's final, and boardrooms are always assessing those kind of risks.
All right, very interesting. So, Karina, what about the central question, though, as to whether the Emergencies Act was necessary?
Well, today we heard repeatedly that no question it was necessary for the towing of the trucks. And we kind of heard hints of that before. And so that was the only way they were going to be able to tow trucks was if they could compel the companies to tow them. There was also talk about questions over whether perhaps the federal government could institute a trade corridor because, well, they had jurisdiction over the bridges. They did not have jurisdiction over where the blockages actually were on municipal and provincial lands. And the frustration that Ontario wasn't doing more to help with this and that putting all the pressure on the federal government for that. And that the only way out of that, really, if Ontario wasn't going to come to the table, was for instance, Windsor to ask the federal government to invoke the Emergencies Act. And there would be a cascading movement from that. Have a listen.
And that if the only feasible way that they have to do something, and because the streets of Windsor are under the jurisdiction of the municipal authorities of Windsor and the provincial government, and if they really truly want us to solve this, the only way to do that is to declare an emergency and ask us to intervene through our Emergencies Act. That would be a very provocative approach, and it may succeed in having Ontario come back to the table and start kind of working, using their authorities to solve the problem.
We also did hear about a number of threats. Obviously, the Government of Canada lawyer in cross-examination trying to make the case that there was quite serious threats going on that perhaps people weren't aware of, including potential importation of serious ammunition. There was someone who was picked up in Ottawa who was linked to a search of weapons in the York region near Toronto. And so, trying to make that case that, there was a national security threat beyond just the economics of the situation.
Karina, thank you. The CBC's Karina Roman live in Ottawa.